August 29th, 2005, New Orleans, Louisiana. A city built below sea level, protected by walls of concrete and earth that had stood for generations. In one single morning, those walls would fail in 53 different places. By nightfall, 80% of the city would be underwater. By the time the water finally stopped rising, more than 1,800 people across 5 states would be dead, over 1 million people displaced from their homes, and a major American city would sit abandoned, drowned, and silent for weeks. But here's what almost nobody knows. The city's own engineers had warned, in writing, years before the storm, that the levees might not hold. The warning was buried, ignored, and on the morning of August 29th, it came true in the worst possible way. This is the full story of the costliest natural disaster in United States history, and the failures, both natural and man-made, that turned a hurricane into a catastrophe. To understand what happened in 2005, you have to understand something strange about New Orleans itself. Most of the city sits below sea level, in some neighborhoods as much as 10 feet below. It's a bowl carved out between the Mississippi River, Lake Pontchartrain, and the Gulf of Mexico. And for nearly 300 years, the only thing keeping that bowl from filling with water has been a network of man-made levees, floodwalls, and pumps. Here's the unsettling fact. New Orleans has been sinking for over a century. The very ground beneath the city compacts and subsides over time, partly due to natural soil settlement, partly due to oil and gas extraction in the surrounding wetlands, and partly due to the levees themselves. By containing the Mississippi River instead of letting it flood and deposit fresh sediment as it always had, engineers had unintentionally starved the land of the very soil that once rebuilt it every spring. In effect, the walls built to protect the city were slowly helping to sink it. By the 1990s, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and independent researchers had already flagged that several floodwalls in the city, including the ones protecting the lower 9th Ward, were built using outdated design standards from the 1960s and might not withstand a major hurricane storm surge. The warnings were published, funding requests were made. Most were never fully acted on. New Orleans had also survived close calls before: Hurricane Betsy in 1965, Hurricane Camille in 1969. Storms that flooded parts of the city but never fully breached its defenses. That survival bred something dangerous: familiarity. Residents who had weathered smaller storms before assumed the walls would hold again. It's the same psychological trap disaster researchers see over and over. Each near miss makes people slightly less afraid of the next one, right up until the storm that doesn't miss. August 23rd, 2005. A tropical depression forms over the southeastern Bahamas, the 11th of the season, unremarkable at first glance. Meteorologists name it Tropical Storm Katrina the following day. Katrina made her first landfall on August 25th near the Florida/Broward County line as a moderate Category 1 hurricane. It killed several people in South Florida, but was treated, at the time, as a fairly ordinary storm passing through. Then something happened that terrified meteorologists more than the storm itself. As Katrina crossed into the Gulf of Mexico, she passed directly over the Loop Current, a ribbon of exceptionally warm, deep water that acts like rocket fuel for hurricanes. Sea surface temperatures in the Gulf that August were running significantly above average, some of the warmest ever recorded in the region. Katrina absorbed that heat and began to explode in strength. In a single 24-hour period, her sustained winds jumped from around 100 miles per hour to 175 miles per hour, a jump meteorologists call rapid intensification, and one of the fastest such jumps ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin. A storm that intensifies gradually gives a coastline time to psychologically adjust to its danger. A storm that nearly doubles in strength overnight gives a coastline almost no time to feel it coming. By August 28th, Katrina had briefly become a Category 5 hurricane, with a central pressure of 902 millibars. At the time, the fourth lowest pressure ever recorded in an Atlantic hurricane. Lower pressure means a more powerful storm engine. This was as strong as hurricanes get, and New Orleans sat almost directly in its crosshairs. August 28th, 9:30 a.m. Mayor Ray Nagin issued the first mandatory evacuation order in the city's 287-year history. It was a historic, almost unthinkable decision for a city that had never ordered a full evacuation before, even during Betsy or Camille. An estimated 80% of the metro area's 1.3 million residents left in the following 36 hours, one of the largest evacuations in American history at that point. But that still left well over 100,000 people behind. Not out of stubbornness in most cases, but out of necessity. Nearly 30% of New Orleans households did not own a car. Many were elderly, disabled, or too poor to afford a hotel room and gas money for a trip with no return date. Some were hospital patients who simply could not be moved. For those with nowhere else to go, the city designated the Louisiana Superdome as a shelter of last resort, a phrase that would take on grim meaning within 48 hours. By the night before landfall, roughly 26,000 people had crowded inside, many bringing only what they could carry: a bag of clothes, medication, family photos, sometimes a pet smuggled in against the rules. Here's a detail most documentaries skip entirely. Officials had specifically warned that the Superdome was not designed as a hurricane shelter in the traditional sense. It had no independent power source strong enough to run air conditioning and full plumbing for tens of thousands of people over multiple days. And its roof, while sturdy, had never been stress tested against sustained hurricane force wind for as long as it was about to endure. August 29th, 6:10 a.m. Katrina made her second and final U.S. landfall near Buras Triumph, Louisiana, as a Category 3 hurricane with sustained winds of 125 miles per hour. Though she had weakened slightly from her Category 5 peak, the storm surge behind her, the wall of ocean water pushed ahead of the hurricane, remained at Category 5 strength, built up over days of the storm's approach across unusually warm water. 6:30 a.m. Water began overtopping the Industrial Canal flood wall in the lower 9th Ward, one of the poorest and most historically black neighborhoods in the city. Residents who had stayed, many elderly, many without transportation, had no way of knowing that the wall protecting their homes had already begun to give way in the dark. 7:45 a.m. A barge, torn loose from its moorings in the Industrial Canal, slammed directly into the already weakened flood wall. The wall failed catastrophically. Survivors would later describe what happened next not as a flood, but as a wave, a wall of water moving with enough force to lift entire houses clean off their foundations and carry them, intact, several blocks away. Some homes were later found resting on top of parked cars. One house came to rest on top of another house entirely. They had done exactly what they were told: stay inside, stay low, stay away from windows. It made no difference. The water didn't come from the sky. It came from below and from behind, through a wall that had already been failing for years on paper, long before it failed for real that morning. 8:14 a.m. The National Weather Service confirmed the first breach at the 17th Street Canal on the opposite side of the city from the lower 9th Ward. Within hours, a second breach opened at the London Avenue Canal, then a second breach at 17th Street. New Orleans was no longer flooding from one direction. It was filling from 4 separate points simultaneously, like a bathtub with the drain plugged and every faucet running at once. By early afternoon, an estimated 80% of the city was underwater. In the hardest hit neighborhoods, floodwaters reached as high as 20 feet. Street signs disappeared entirely. For thousands of residents, the only escape route left was upward, through a window, and eventually through the roof. Here's a detail that stuns people outside the Gulf Coast. Many older homes in Louisiana keep an axe stored in the attic. It's a generational tradition, quietly passed down through families who've lived through past floods. Not for chopping wood, but for chopping a way out. When the water rises faster than you can escape down the stairs, the attic becomes a trap unless you can break through the roof from the inside. During Katrina, that axe in the attic tradition saved an unknown number of lives. Residents chopped through their own ceilings as water rose beneath them, climbing out onto rooftops to wait, sometimes for days, to be spotted by a rescue helicopter. Some, without an axe, used whatever they had: a hammer, a golf club, bare hands against rotted wood. Not everyone made it through in time. Inside the Superdome, the storm was tearing the building apart from the outside in real time, with 26,000 people trapped beneath it. Around 2 a.m., a large section of the outer roof membrane peeled away entirely, exposing part of the crowd below to the storm directly. Rain poured in. Then, a second section of roofing gave way. Backup power failed within the first day. In 95-degree August heat, with no working air conditioning, toilets stopped functioning almost immediately. With tens of thousands of people and no working plumbing, conditions inside deteriorated into something close to a public health emergency within 48 hours. Food and water supplies, stopped for a shorter emergency, began running critically low. Communication with the outside world was sporadic at best. They had followed every instruction given to them, gone to the shelter of last resort exactly as told, and the shelter itself very nearly became a disaster of its own. At Memorial Medical Center, doctors and nurses faced one of the darkest triage decisions in American medical history. As floodwaters rose into the building's lower floors and backup generators began failing one by one, medical staff had to decide, essentially patient by patient, who would be evacuated first, when helicopters could only take a handful of people at a time, and some patients depended entirely on machines that were about to lose power. Investigations into deaths that occurred at the hospital during those days would continue in courts and headlines for years afterward, raising uncomfortable questions about medical ethics under catastrophic, no-win conditions. At Charity Hospital, one of the oldest public hospitals in the country, staff waded through waist-deep contaminated water, carrying patients on their backs and on floating mattresses, evacuating the building almost entirely by boat, navigating streets that had become urban canals. While the world's attention focused on the Superdome, a second, largely unplanned shelter formed at the Ernest N. Morial Convention Center. Unlike the Superdome, it had not been officially designated or stocked as a shelter at all. Thousands of evacuees simply gathered there, believing help would arrive, and by the second day, an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 people were sheltering inside with almost no food, water, medical care, or security presence for days. Conditions inside became desperate. National media broadcast images that shocked the country. Elderly residents in wheelchairs left uncollected. Families sleeping on bare concrete. Armed National Guard troops eventually deployed not for rescue, but for crowd control. It would take days before the first significant aid convoys arrived. By August 31st, the floodwaters had largely stopped rising, but the human crisis was still accelerating. An estimated 100,000 people remained trapped across the metro area, on rooftops, in flooded attics, inside hospitals and nursing homes that had lost both power and any realistic way to evacuate quickly. The rescue effort that followed became one of the largest search and rescue operations in American history. The U.S. Coast Guard alone conducted over 33,500 individual rescues in the days following landfall, a number that remains one of the largest peacetime rescue totals ever recorded by the agency. Volunteer boat owners, many of them local fishermen and hunters with airboats and skiffs, launched an informal rescue fleet that became known informally as the Cajun Navy, a grassroots effort that would later become a template for citizen-led disaster response in future storms. But for thousands, help came too late or didn't come at all. When the water finally receded, some areas remained flooded for nearly a month. It left behind a landscape almost unrecognizable to the people who had spent their whole lives there. More than 1,800 people were confirmed dead across Louisiana, Mississippi, and 3 other Gulf states, making Katrina one of the deadliest hurricanes in modern American history. Researchers who studied excess mortality in the following year, accounting for deaths caused indirectly by displacement, lost medical care, and stress-related illness, believe the true toll may be significantly higher than the official count. Over 800,000 people were displaced from their homes, the largest displacement of Americans since the Dust Bowl migrations of the 1930s. Some never returned. More than 1 million housing units across the Gulf Coast were damaged or destroyed. Total economic damages exceeded $125 billion, making Katrina, at the time, the single costliest natural disaster in United States history, a record it would hold for over a decade. The lower 9th Ward, the neighborhood where the very first wall failed that morning, lost nearly half its pre-storm population permanently. 20 years later, entire blocks remain empty lots, slowly reclaimed by grass and trees, where houses once stood. Here's an eerie detail few people know. The force of the flooding was strong enough in parts of the city to lift caskets straight out of above-ground cemetery vaults, a common burial style in low-lying New Orleans, where graves are built above ground due to the high water table. Dozens of caskets were found afterward. Some drifted blocks from their original cemeteries, forcing an unprecedented effort to identify and return the displaced remains to their proper resting places. Ethel Freeman was 91 years old. Her son, Herbert, wheeled her to the convention center, believing help was on its way, exactly as authorities had instructed. She died there, still in her wheelchair, waiting. Her body remained uncollected for days, covered only with a blanket, in full view of national news cameras, an image that became one of the defining and most criticized symbols of the government's slow response. A man remembered only as an elderly resident of St. Rita's nursing home in St. Bernard Parish became one of 35 residents who died when floodwaters overtook the facility. The nursing home's owners had chosen not to evacuate, believing, as many did, that the building had weathered past storms and would weather this one too. It hadn't been designed to survive a wall of water this size, and neither had the belief that kept everyone inside. 2 nurses at Memorial Medical Center refused evacuation orders on 3 separate occasions, staying behind each time to care for patients considered too fragile to be moved yet. Their decisions, made in genuinely impossible conditions with no good options, would later come under intense legal and public scrutiny. A sobering reminder that heroism during a disaster rarely looks clean, simple, or universally agreed upon from the outside looking in. Jabbar Gibson was 19 years old when he did something no official plan accounted for. Finding an abandoned school bus sitting in a flooded lot, with no training, no authorization, and no permission from anyone, he got behind the wheel himself and drove it, packed with over 60 of his stranded neighbors, all the way to Houston, Texas. According to Houston officials, it was the first busload of Katrina evacuees to reach the city, arriving hours ahead of any organized government convoy. He was initially detained on arrival for having no license to drive the vehicle. He was released once officials understood what he'd actually done. Here's a detail that unfolded quietly, years after the cameras left. In the aftermath, FEMA distributed over 100,000 travel trailers to displaced families as temporary housing while homes were rebuilt. Within months, residents began reporting persistent headaches, nosebleeds, and respiratory problems. Investigations eventually confirmed that many of the trailers, manufactured hastily to meet overwhelming demand, contained unsafe levels of formaldehyde in their construction materials. It became one of the quieter, longer tail scandals of the disaster. Thousands of families who survived the storm itself were then exposed to a slow-building health hazard inside the very shelters meant to protect them. In the years following Katrina, the federal government invested over $14 billion into rebuilding and reinforcing the city's flood protection system. New flood walls, massive storm surge barriers, and upgraded pumping stations designed to withstand a storm far stronger than the one that broke the old system. It remains one of the largest civil engineering projects in American history. Some neighborhoods rebuilt fully, even thrived. Others, like large sections of the lower Ninth Ward, never fully recovered their original population or character. The city's demographics shifted permanently. Tens of thousands of displaced residents, many of them from the city's most historic Black neighborhoods, never returned, resettling instead in Houston, Atlanta, and cities across the country. Katrina exposed something that took the country years to fully reckon with. Not just an engineering failure, but a stark demonstration of who got left behind when the water came, and how much of that outcome had been decided long before the storm ever formed over the Bahamas. The storm didn't create those divides. It simply made them impossible to look away from. 20 years on, the walls have been rebuilt stronger, but the water left behind more than damage. It left a fault line in a city's history, splitting everything that came before it from everything that came after.